With the advent of globalization, outsourcing, enhanced connectivity, and higher reliance on suppliers, supply chain disruptions have become one of the resilience profession's greatest concerns. Good afternoon. I'm Russell Wooldridge, Senior Director of Business Development at DRI International, welcoming you today to our latest webinar, sponsored by MetricStream. This afternoon, we'll explore conceptual and practical developments on supply chain risk and resilience, along with the application of business continuity beyond organizational boundaries. Presenting is Don Klock. He is a director at Rutgers Center for Supply Chain Management, which is dedicated to the development of leading-edge supply chain strategies and practical solutions to problems encountered by the business community. To ensure best audio quality, we ask that everyone in the audience please mute your microphone, clicking the box in the upper right-hand side of the screen. Following his remarks, we'll dive into a question and answer session where Don will answer some of the questions you submitted during the registration period for this webinar. You can also post any additional questions you may have during the presentation in the question box on the lower right-hand side of the screen. Don will answer those as well. His responses will be available when the complete video is posted on our website. Now, let's get on with today's program.
Thanks, Russell. I'm going to go ahead and cover resilience in supply chains. Here's the major topic that we'll be covering today. Moving beyond firm boundaries is resilience enhanced by supply chain continuity programs. And hopefully today we'll leave you with 3 or 4 takeaways and answer this particular questions. We're going to look at both this question from a proactive standpoint and a reactive standpoint, which you'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So before we get into it, I think risk management, as people say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I think what you want to do is look like this matador here. Many of you have probably been or at least seen a bullfight, either in Mexico or in Spain. And what we'd like to do is to have that bull just kind of sweep right by us and not hit us. But unfortunately, it doesn't always turn out this way. Too often, risk management ends up catching us off guard. And it's when it does happen, it's not a pretty sight, or worse. So hopefully we don't want to be like these people in the bull ring. So the moral of the story is that you want to be prepared to grab risk management by the horns before it grabs you first. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about what are risks. I'm going to talk about risk management strategies to mitigate those risks. I'm going to look at it, as I said earlier, from a proactive standpoint and a reactive standpoint. And then we're going to allow plenty of times for your questions and discussions. So let's go ahead and get started. So what are some of the supply or procurement risks that have occurred or potentially will occur in the future in your businesses, the people that are listening to this webinar? I'm just going to leave it for a few seconds here for you to think about. I'd like you to just jot down 2 or 3 things just for, we'll come back and review this from my perspective. Okay, so let's take a look at this. I think the point here is I think many of you have probably caught a few of these on your list, but what we really do is need to think more broadly about risk management. Here's happens to be a list that I've had, and many of you probably have some of the things on the list. I think what the point is sometimes we don't think broadly enough about it, and more importantly, we need to identify which are the important risks, and if so, what is our contingency plans around if they happen to occur. I'm just going to mention a few of them here. Obviously, we don't have time today to go through all of them. But, one comes to mind that when I was at Colgate-Palmolive, we were great procurement people, and we had strategically sourced resins for plastics. Those are the little beads that you use, that you blow plastic bottles, either for detergent or water bottles or whatever. It's called plastic resins. And we contracted with the ExxonMobil very large company, one of the largest companies in the United States. And we thought we were very smart in order to have a single source, and ExxonMobil would be able to provide us all the resin that we needed. We had another source in South America we could use as a backup, and then came through Hurricane Katrina. And basically, I remember the pictures to this day, where it looked like this large plant, which was multiple football fields large, sitting in a bathtub of water. And there goes all your plastic resin that you needed for bottles, at least in the United States. So what do? Well, you get a team together. You basically buy every pound that is sitting in any warehouse in the United States. You bring some resin in from outside the United States. You work with ExxonMobil when the plant gets up and running. I remember initially they shipped everything by rail, and then we encouraged them to ship resin by truck to keep us supplied. And to make a long story short, we never shut down any of our factories for not having plastic resin to blow our bottles. So it's a great success story. But it's something that we'll talk about later, about sensing and responding quickly when there is a problem. Some of you, this didn't occur to me personally, but you might be making a simple thing like a gym bag that you're going to use as a promotional item, or potentially as a giveaway. At a sales meeting, somehow a reporter gets into the particular factory in Asia and finds that child labor is there making these bags. While this may be your supplier's problem, it turns out to be your problem, because it ends up having your name, let's say, on the bag. And these are the type of things that happen all the time, and people think that they don't occur because they don't occur in the United States, but they do occur in other parts of the world. The other two, which I'll just mention in passing, which I think have come up on recent lists of surveys, is intellectual property and data security. Data security has moved up the list. It's now number one. About a third of supply chain management people consider it very important, and about almost 71% are at least concerned about data security. Intellectual property has also moved up. So again, thinking broadly about risk management, there are new things that come in to the risk area that you need to consider. Data security, intellectual property has risen probably from, somewhere around 10th up to the 1st and 2nd now. So it doesn't surprise you, but what are you doing about those risks? This happens to be a survey by, I believe it's Rotella, but there are other surveys out there on the web. Are companies prepared? Well, 80% of executives don't, or have not even defined what constitutes a risk. 70% do not have crisis management teams or processes in place, and 70% do not know what to do if in the event is a crisis. So the real thing is that the idea is that most companies today are really not prepared. And I just read a recent study from IBM that wasn't quite the same numbers, but they were very similar. So it hasn't really gotten all that better with time. So before we go into some of the strategies and processes, why have these risks increased over time? Really, 4 reasons. One is that people have outsourced more and more products and services. So companies are now taking many of the things they used to do within their 4 walls, and they've actually worked with their suppliers and outsourced usually through procurement those products. Services. I mean, you just think about that if you're calling in for your service to get on your credit card. 9 chances out of 10, the person that answers the phone is not in the United States. I'm not saying that's bad, but many of these services are even outsourced. Over the last decade or so, large increases in global sourcing and offshoring to outside the United States. The really world-class procurement groups have found value in going outside the United States, and they've done a lot of offshoring. That increases the risk dramatically. It is nothing like manufacturing, a couple miles down the road in the United States. You're moving it to another country with different cultures and people. Then we have our supply chain or potentially our financial people want just-in-time inventory. We will look at a particular case that they had 2 to 3 days worth of inventory and they had a problem and what they did to turn that situation around. But everybody's looking to get cash in their businesses, and just-in-time inventory is one strategy to do that. And lastly, not to say that these things have not increased, the environment of 24/7 news coverage really highlights the problem quicker. So even though even though it has increased, one might say that when things do happen, they end up getting seen more readily, faster, more visible. So that actually pushes the fact that the risks are out there. So let's jump into some strategies to mitigate risk. The question that we started with is resilient enhanced by supply chain continuity programs? And I'm going to look at two approaches. I'm going to look at proactive and reactive. We'll start with proactive in a minute, but I want to make a point before we move on. It's important to realize that these are not mutually exclusive, meaning you don't have just proactive and just reactive. What you really need is to have both of these strategies and processes in place in order to have a robust continuity program. So the first one, which I think nobody would be surprised with, is you need a very robust certification process of your suppliers. I think this is the first step in order to have to mitigate risks. And I'm going to walk through some of those roles and responsibilities and the type of processes you have. And the challenge I would give to the listeners on this particular webinar is that has anybody reviewed this recently, and make sure that it's really robust. Underline the word robust. Many times these things get stale, haven't been updated, people forget, they don't implement things like they should. So even though you might have a title of it, it may not be working as properly as you once thought. I'm not going to go through all these bullets. We'll let DRI provide the slides if you need them. But I'll just mention a few things I think are important. The first thing is that have you clearly outlined the responsibilities of the key players? Procurement is one of them. I have a bias to say that procurement really needs to lead this process, and then obviously bring people like in from quality and engineering and other people in the business. But they're the ones that need to schedule the visits. They have the relationship with the supplier, and most importantly, that when there are action plans, or what we call FAPs here, this is follow-up action plans. What you want to be able to say is they should be responsible to make sure that these things get done. They're the ones that have the relationship with the supplier, and they need to make sure that they leverage their relationship to make sure it gets done. Quality, very important, and particularly if you're dealing with direct materials. You want to make sure you have a good pool of auditors, and they want to be well trained in all the techniques, and they will obviously work with procurement to facilitate their checklist, and they also will be able to identify risks in the supply chain and in the procurement area. Somebody will have some sort of audit tool. This just happens to be a couple of chemical suppliers and packaging. It would depend on your type of industry. These things aren't hard to create. There are a lot of examples that you can pick up in textbooks or even in on the web. But this is just one example. Has some sort of checklist of activities and sections that you want to go through, where this is a little hard to read here, but sufficient, deficient, what things you want to do to be able to note whether there's a problem. And this will be a multi-page form, obviously, in a lot of different areas. But I think you get the list. Very simple to rate. Quality people usually take the lead on here, but if there are other things that need to be examined, it could be done by other team members. Then once you do that with the suppliers, you want to have some sort of a rating risk. We took this from I was at Colgate. We actually took this from the safety people, is that you can't do all the different risks, but let's rate them A, B, C. A's you got to do right away. It's a high risk. It needs to be done very quickly in a 30-day period. B's probably gives you a little bit longer, and C's might be something you might work on over a 6-month to a year period. But the important thing here is that You can't treat all risks the same in the supplier, and the ones that really need to get done, you want to get those done first. This is something we implemented when I was at Colgate. It was a quality agreement. And what we found is that when we reviewed our processes is that many times we would have a purchase order or a contract with attached specifications, and we would end up going into doing a follow-up visit with the supplier. We would say, where is our specifications? We would find that somehow they had used their specifications and not necessarily ours, and that's sometimes why you have some defects that occur. And I think it's important to have a quality agreement that you can hand to the supplier's quality, and it's very clear what needs to be done, and it meets our specifications and our quality control process capability, as well as you can come back and audit against it. We would actually post these agreements on our website so that it was transparent to all the people in procurement and in the quality area. So this is a kind of an addition to adding something very formal, so both the supplier and ourselves truly understand what those quality requirements are, and it's easily recognizable to the people in the supplier's business. This is the most important thing I've found that what happens is I think over time people mean well, but they don't follow up. I think this is critical. First, typically we'll have some sort of data performance that's in your systems. In the case of SAP, you have nonconformance and material inspection data. You can usually pull that off online in these big systems, and even if you don't, you have some sort of database that might have these things. You want to review those with the supplier on a regular basis. And from those quality audits that you did, you're going to have a number of follow-up action points that you need to follow up on and make sure they were complete. And I think you really need to come back and occasionally go back and say, were the A items completed as we planned? And I know people get busy working on the next project or the next problem, but it's very important that these follow-up items get done on a timely basis. And I think this requires people to go in and say, where are we on these particular items? What are we doing to complete these items? So this is a very important part of a supplier certification process. And then lastly, as I mentioned, many of these agreements and specifications were posted on a website. So anybody in the world that wanted to see these agreements, obviously there's things from time to time you can't, like pricing, that you wouldn't necessarily put up on a website like this. But certainly you'd want to be able for all your business partners to have those agreements so they can look at them and be transparent and know what's going on with that particular supplier. Okay? And lastly, I think sometimes we try to focus in on the supplier, too much, and it's not the only thing that's important here. The first thing is that when there are problems, depending on the severity of the problems, frequent and timely communication of issues and problems are very important. In the case of items that were in the crisis that we talked about earlier, that is identified as a crisis, for at least at Colgate, we ended up having to sign an annual agreement. We said that in these types of crisis situations, we'd report these to various senior manager within 48 hours. Now, why would they do that? Well, because they want to get after these things and correct them before they get a lot worse. I'm going to talk about an example in a few minutes called Sensing and Responding, a case study, but this is really important about frequent and timely communications of issues and problems. Hopefully you have some sort of a monthly, quarterly supplier risk management review when you're looking at all your suppliers. And again, there are ways to identify these suppliers. You can have some sort of a color coding or ABC or whatever. But what you want to do is, particularly the A suppliers, you want it reviewed not only by procurement, but a cross-functional team, probably including your supply chain partners, manufacturing, maybe your risk management people and your finance people, so they can get a good feel for what's going on with these key suppliers. You want to build those risk management strategies in what we call category management processes. This is where you would look at a category and or supplier and say we want to build those things in writing into those category management processes so they can be looked at and followed up on. You You want to be able to have contingency plans around those suppliers and commodities, and some sort of continuous improvement plan. I would make a point here that sometimes these things aren't fixed overnight. So what you might want to do is you might want to at least have a plan in place to say these things are going to take 6 months to fix. These are going to take 3 weeks to fix, so you'll know that these things are progressing. And lastly, you got to have some sort of comprehensive, dependable, intelligent capability is a must. We'll talk a little bit about big data and business intelligence a little later in the webinar. So let's talk about the second proactive strategy. It's called invest in redundancy. The example that I've used here happens to be around manufacturing plants, but it easily could be used for suppliers. It really requires people to do a careful analysis. And the example I'm going to use, which isn't directly related to procurement, it's about manufacturing plants, is equally applicable to suppliers. And people do run these types of network studies with suppliers also. But let's assume for this particular example that this consumer products company has 40 facilities all over the world. They've done a very sophisticated network optimization study determining that if they reduce their facilities by 17 and they left the 23 open, they could save $40 million per year, and we can satisfy all the demand. So on the surface, it looks very good, but I need to ask some very probing questions around this analysis. This particular analysis left no design and no plants, in North America or Europe. That seems risky to me. The remaining facilities that they left in Asia and Latin America were fully utilized. So such if there was a problem, I don't think they could react quick enough to meet the needs. And then lastly, you got to look at the geopolitical and other problems that might occur in these particular regions, and analyze the particular, what could potentially happen in these countries. So on the surface, it looks very good, but then it comes back, the decision is actually very risky. Now, for people that haven't seen these types of studies, I've seen hundreds of them. They all look like this. This chart obviously looks at inventory, duty, transportation, fixed cost, variable cost. And because of the nature of the variable cost across the number of plants, you can see here that this bottom top curve here, which is the total cost, is the optimal solution, saving $40 million, is 23 plants, as you can see in the bottom. But look at more if it goes back to 30. And you have 30 plants, add 7 more plants, doesn't cost all that much. This particular case, about $2.5 million. So one might say, really need to look at it from a risk standpoint. So when you analyze these trade-offs, you find out that while the closing of the 17 plants and leaving 23 open does minimize the cost, it's relatively flat around that total cost curve. But increasing the number of plants from 23 back to 30 increases the cost by $2.5 million. So the point would be here is that really didn't cost you all that much money. I mean, in the end of the day, is it $40 million? Is it $37.5 million? Not a big difference, but the risk is very different. And you can do the same thing with your suppliers. And even as simple, if your procurement people come to you and say you must have this supplier, it's got the lowest cost, the good question to ask would be, what happens if we have 2 suppliers? Many times, because of the competitive nature of these bids and that are submitted by the suppliers, the first and second supplier are within 5%. So it doesn't really cost you that much. But you think it needs to be looked at, either very sophisticated through network optimization or potentially just asking the simple question about the cost of the second supplier. So coming back to the second approach, which is this reactive approach, we're going to cover 2 of them to take a look at. The first one is sensing and responding strategy. We've touched on this before when I mentioned the Cortina issue that was occurred while I was at Colgate. It's really about speed and sensing and responding that can help the firm to overcome unexpected supply chain problems. And companies that don't do this can have major effects in their supply chain. And actually, in this particular case that I'm going to go through, it actually forced the company to exit the U.S. market. This particular case is Nokia and Ericsson on phones. There was a supplier that supplies both Nokia and Ericsson at a Philips semiconductor plant in Albuquerque, New Mexico. What did Nokia do? So they sensed and responded very quickly. They changed the design to source components from alternate suppliers. They ended up finding where it was sourced outside the United States and shipped products in, and they got the component parts that they needed in about 5 days. Let's look at what Nokia did. It was quite different. It took 4 weeks for this particular problem to reach the news of upper management. It realized that they were in real trouble after about 5 weeks. It cost them $400 million of potential sales. That yes, the loss was partly covered by insurance, but quite frankly, that doesn't really help you in this situation. It overall lost about $1.6 billion, and they ended up exiting the cell phone market. And as you know, Ericsson's not here. So 2 different experiences. Nokia had one experience where they sensed and responded quickly, and Ericsson was slow and basically ended up hurting their business, not only in the short term, but in the long term. The second strategy is what we call adaptability strategy. This is very difficult to implement. We'll talk about it. This is a Toyota example, but it's something to at least consider, particularly with some of your key suppliers. So as I said earlier, this is one of the most difficult ones to implement. It requires all players in the supply chain to work together. They got to have good supplier relationship management. They got to have the same culture, and they want to work towards the benefit for everybody. You need a community of suppliers that will work together and reorganize to correct the situation. So this was Toyota. For people that haven't read The Toyota Way, I might suggest to you that it's a great book. This particular example is in that book. It's called The Toyota Way. It talks a lot about the culture of Toyota. They usually run a lot of single source suppliers, so that's not unusual. Aisin Sekin was their sole supplier for their brake fluid proportioning valves. It's a P valve. It only costs about $7. They had a fire in Japan in their factory. And basically they said, we can start up in 2 weeks, but it'll take 6 months to complete recovery. The problem was that Toyota was producing close to 15,500 vehicles per day. 15,500 vehicles per day. And as I mentioned earlier, they're great at just-in-time inventory, and it basically only had 2 to 3 days inventory. So this was a major problem with a very small, inexpensive part. What they do, Toyota got the blueprints and distributed it to all potential suppliers in their supply chain. This isn't just the other suppliers that make it, but all the suppliers. They took the engineers from the supplier and their own company and relocated it to the supplier's facilities. They did buy some from a competitor brother. They got existing machining and adapted it to make these valves to the original specification. Had new machinery was acquired on the spot market to make these valves, and within days, let me underline days, very little expensive making P valves, they got the factory, their factory up and running. There are over 200 of Toyota suppliers were involved in this process. So again, a little hard to read, but let me just point it out here. This is the cars per day, 15,500. You can see it goes to 0, and then it ramps back up, as you can see. This is when the accident, there were 4 P valves in each car, so you multiply 4 by getting up here, and you can see that this basically went to 0. The point of this chart is that you can see that this was fixed, at least up and running, within days, not weeks, right? Not a half a month, days. And you can see how that strategy got them up and running relatively quickly, almost 90% of production and eventually 100% out here, as you can see, and brought the plant up and running in days. So this isn't going to work for all your suppliers and all your commodities, but something to think about. So what was the outcome? So the accident did cost the supplier $65 million, cost Toyota about $1.3 billion. The damage, however, was reduced from 30 billion yen, or 250 million, with extra shifts and overtime. Toyota issued $100 million of token appreciation to all those suppliers that worked on the collaboration to make this happen. That's a partnership. Now, you can ask the question is, do you think our U.S. suppliers would be able to do this? We don't know. But the question is that it's something at least to think about how is your relationship with the suppliers, and could you actually do something like this? Just going to talk briefly for a minute about single sources and adaptability. Many people say, oh, we have to have dual sourcing and other things. There is good reason to have single sources. So I don't want to discount it to say the only answer is to have multiple sources. It does achieve a high economies of scale. Obviously, you're running larger runs for a single supplier. But the reason Toyota does it, and you'll see this in the Toyota way, is that it creates a consistent quality that they can count on. It has a process capability and allows them, therefore, not to worry about quality and have what we call a just-in-time mode of operation with low inventories and very little problems in their factories. And you have to make that decision what you want. People ask me many times, do I need, should we have a single or dual, double, backup sourcing? It's a decision you have to make. There are pluses and minuses. The only thing I would say is that if you are going to go the single sourcing route, you need to think about some of these strategies and how you might implement them if there was a problem. Certainly you need a contingency plan. So there is no right answer here. It depends. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about the role of big data in business intelligence. I claim that you need big data and business intelligence both in the proactive and reactive strategies. For example, in the proactive side, you're going to need a lot of data. You're going to do process capability studies. You're going to look at quality results. So you're going to need a lot of data in order to make that decision and look for risk and mitigate those risks. Right? In the case of doing network optimizations, if you've ever done one of those studies with your suppliers, you're going to need a huge amount of data to be able to make those decisions. In the reactive strategies, certainly you want to be proactive. There are many third parties and software providers that can give you Google information, or you can use maps or weather maps or whatever you're doing. Certainly you'd want to know the quicker you can respond, quicker you can sense, the quicker you can respond. So that's very important. There's many software providers and third-party companies that are ready to assist. So you need to know that. It seems that every time I go to a trade show, there's always one or two more people running a booth there in this particular area. This type of big data and business intelligence can be used for your Tier 1, Tier 2 upstream suppliers. One of the issues you have, of course, is that sometimes these suppliers are private, so you get very limited data, but it certainly is worth, if nothing else, to get the data if you can. I last would just leave you with, please be careful not to say that the data does not guarantee risk-free environments. The data's got to be timely and accurate. It's got to be able to be user-friendly. Many times, let's take weather, for example. In the case of the flooding in Thailand a few years ago, you can use weather maps to see when those particular the weather is going to be in Thailand. But something you can see displays make it easier. And lastly, it's got to be actionable. More data doesn't make it actionable. It has to be in some form where you can say, this is something I need to address right now. So big data and business intelligence is important. It's gotten a lot better and more sophisticated with time. I think you just have to be careful not to assume that drives every decision. So where do we end up on this? So resilience in supply chains. The key is process and strategies. So on the proactive side, we looked at having robust supplier certification process. I would ask you as a group to say, if you have a supplier certification process, you need to probably audit it and go see, is it robust? Has it been updated? Has it been reviewed by senior management? The second one is invest in redundancy. This can be as sophisticated as a network optimization study or as simple as saying, let's look at the cost of the second supplier. In the case of reactive, sensing and responding strategy is very effective. We gave 2 or 3 examples in this particular webinar. And adaptability, the Toyota example, difficult to make it happen, but it's something to at least consider. And then lastly, I think big data and business intelligence certainly can help in this particular case facilitate these strategies in order to mitigate risk. Just a few other thoughts. Clearly, you have to determine who is responsible for the supplier risk, and don't assume somebody else is doing it. I personally have a bias to say it should be procurement, but in some companies it's quality, in some companies it's your risk management and or your insurance people. But is it really clear who is responsible? Because when it happens, they're going to say who's responsible, who does what. It has to be very clear. We touched upon focusing on suppliers not enough. Things around communication and awareness plans. Certainly continuous improvement plans are a must. The use of leveraging big data. Don't get trapped into the idea that it's an ends-all, mean-all solution that if I got the data, we're not going to have any risks. It's not true. It has to be actionable, timely, and be able to have it visible so people can see it. And lastly, these complex risks require really a strategic, holistic approach. Obviously, you want to use the proactive first, but then if not, you want to be able to have the reactive. And when it happens, this is a legal term that many of you may be familiar with, time is of the essence. So much like sensing and responding, it's very important when these things do happen, you want to be able to go after it very quickly. And just one last thought is remember the objective of these strategies and process is not to eliminate risks. And I believe without risk, there's no progress. So, if you're going after a supplier that has considerably cost advantages to it, there's going to be risks around it. But it's the right thing to do. There are risks. But instead, we can use these risk management strategies and processes to help mitigate and manage it to be successful in our businesses. So coming back to the question we started with, moving beyond firm boundaries, is a resilient enhanced by supply chain continuity programs? I say definitely yes. And remember, you have to grab risk management by the horns before it grabs you first. Is this you?
Thanks, Don. Before we get to our Q&A, here's a brief word from our webinar sponsor, MetricStream.
This webinar is sponsored by MetricStream. MetricStream is the industry leader in providing world's leading organizations with business continuity management software to facilitate business resilience, crisis recovery, and supply chain continuity. It has been consistently ranked as a leader by industry analysts across customer experience and product innovations. MetricStream Business Continuity Management software provides integrated business continuity planning, crisis management, vendor supply risk planning, and IT resiliency capabilities, along with integrated emergency mass notification capability also. The app provides a highly configurable system to manage your business continuity needs and connects the business continuity program with the enterprise risk management model while streamlining and automating the business continuity workflows for optimal efficiency. Today, MetricStream is leveraged by 6 of the world's top 10 banks and numerous Fortune 500 organizations for their business continuity management and governance risk and compliance processes. Visit www.metricstream.com for more information.
Now it's time for some listener questions. First up, in terms of business intelligence and big data, who's leading the U.S. and who's leading in the world?
As I said earlier, every time I go to a trade show or I'm speaking at a conference that happens to have these supplier booths, I always see new people. And now that I'm a professor, I haven't evaluated these fully, but I certainly listen to their presentation as well as their look at their information. Certainly in the world, I think one of the best is IBM. IBM has really thought this through, and if you need somebody to work with you on a world basis, they would be a possibility. I have seen presentation and worked with people from Zycus, if you're familiar with them. Coupa, C-O-U-P-A, is another outfit. D&B, if you're familiar with them, particularly strong in the United States, they have some capabilities. I would recommend to do a complete search on the internet to see. As a matter of fact, for those that might have procurement people going to the Institute of Supply Management this year at their annual conference, they have a whole track on risk management. There also are independent companies such as Gartner that does evaluate these types of things from time to time. If you're going to do network optimization, there is a company called Lamasoft. They're probably the best in the business today that can do some of these studies for you. So hopefully, I don't have a answer for you, but give you at least a few places to look. And by all means, I think it requires a full software information review.
Our next question is, how can a resilient supply chain program go beyond standards in engaging partners?
Well, certainly when you're working with your partners, you want, in the word underline partners, you want to be able to have them understand and be a part of the discussion. You don't want to, an example would be, you want to make sure that you understand their contingency plans and they understand your contingency plans. And while we haven't done much of it, at least when I was in the business area, you can certainly do some mock things that can occur. There are companies that can help facilitate you. Way back in my Mars days, we actually had people develop a crisis, and then we had a mock interview crisis that we had to handle as a management team in a particular location. So there are those types of things. But I think a real important thing is the word partners, your suppliers. There should be no doubt that what are they going to do if there's a problem and what are you going to do? And it should be discussed on a regular basis and followed up on.
Finally, we have a listener who would like you to speak to the need for organizations to work with their small business partners and vendors by including them in planning, tabletops, and drills.
Yes, I do recognize that that it's certainly more difficult for smaller companies and smaller suppliers to be able to work together. It doesn't mean you can't, though. I mean, it's all about priorities in my mind. So, for example, is that you can have a simplistic supplier certification process and certainly have contingency plans that doesn't require a lot of time and effort. And certainly you can have a policy in place such as if something happens in within 48 hours that you can basically notify management and sense and respond quickly. You certainly, in a smaller business, it would be difficult to do the adaptability strategy, but there are things that you can do and that you should do. And I think one of the things you can do is at least make it a regular topic of discussion twice a year or once a year, that what are going to happen particularly if it's a sole source. So while I have some sympathy for smaller business partners and smaller people, if it's critical for the two businesses to mitigate risk together, there's no reason they can't do some very simple things and very powerful things. You don't need a full-fledged big data and business intelligence system to necessarily mitigate some of your risks.
So, Don, we're going to take a few of the questions that we've received from those that participated in the webinar, as well as some of our certified professionals. The first one comes from one of our MBCPs. How deep should you go when you're vetting your suppliers' resilience?
So I think you're not going to like the beginning of the answer. It's going to be one of these, it depends. But I think the way you would do it, now we didn't cover a lot in this particular webinar on how you assess risk, but there's many tools out there that I'm sure many people on this webinar know about. But assuming you're looking at something like what the business impact is and the likelihood are both high, and if you have business people in the room concerned about this particular supply chain that affects both revenue and profits and let's say high margins, and you determine it's critical. I think you say to yourself then, because the likelihood is high and the business impact is high, that is one that you want to go deep on, as compared to something that is less likely and less business impact. So an analogy would be in the stoplight approach, this particular one would be a red, and it's very, very important to the business, and it's going to affect the P&L if something happens. So assuming you know that, I guess my answer would be you go very deep. You would go to the manufacturer, probably the suppliers, and if necessary, the suppliers. So because it's critical, because if that particular supply chain gets disrupted, it's going to really affect your overall P&L and the company in general. So I think that it may not like it, depends, but if you think about it as very, very, very important to the business, you go as deep as possible.
Well, while you're traveling down that depth, I mean, suppliers, as a company, what do you have as far as control goes over the supplier?
Well, you certainly can audit your supplier. You've audited them before you go, as we talked about in the webinar. And there's absolutely no reason, in most cases, unless there's some sort of confidentiality agreement, that you can also go audit at least the next tier supplier. And you can monitor it. Now, the biggest problem you have in many cases is that many times these people are private, so you don't get a lot of public information. But I would say try to at least, if you think it's critical, go as deep as you can. And certainly you want to go to your supplier, and then I would think you'd want to go to the next tier. Beyond that gets difficult, and sometimes it gets multiplicable, where you get too much to do, and it is. But it's better to go deeper than not just stay with the existing supplier. And there are some tools in place that can help you do some of that.
Another question we've gotten in a number of different forms is what could be one or two of the variables of data that could represent the performance of a supply chain, both quantitative and then qualitative, because qualitative can be used for snap judgments and snap insights to see the bigger picture.
So let me take the qualitative first, and I'll do the quantitative. On the qualitative, I'm assuming you have some sort of big data information that's tracking, let's say, some sort of Google search that's following this particular supplier or weather or something. A good example of a qualitative one might be when they had the floods in Thailand, which was in this particular area that was doing a lot of high-tech manufacturing. Many people were watching the weather. So there's an example of a qualitative thing where you're actually looking at the weather, what is changing every day, is it getting worse or better, and eventually when it hits, hopefully you've done something before it happens. So I think there are things like that, or just simple searches on if the company is in local newspapers or events or those types of things that you could watch. On the quantitative side, I would look at really two ways, which I know the person asking the question is just looking for two, but I would look at both internal and external. So if you're looking at internal, I think something you'd want to watch if you're really concerned about it is what's the inventory levels in your business inside your four walls, and if you have some sort of a supplier managed inventory, what inventory does that person have? And then another one that many people do is just assessing your business risk plans. How often do you do it? What's the percentage that are complete? That's a good guide to say whether or not you're, at least hitting the big ones, and what percentage of your things do you have good backup plans for. If you're looking external, I certainly think I would follow the non-conformance or quality issues. If you're starting to have a lot of quality issues, you certainly want to monitor that, and certainly on-time shipments. You can also do what we call advanced shipping notifications to seeing if it's a long distance, for example, coming from far away. Did it ship on time? Hopefully get some insight if it's late and what the problem is. But I think those are two good external things to watch. And I think it's a combination of all three: qualitative, internal, and external. I know that's more than two, but I think those are all good ones to watch. I think
those are excellent. Those are excellent things to watch. How do we assess supply chain dependencies when it comes to the digital or IT technology? Do you consider that a single point failure, like single sourcing of a supplier, or is that a broader
as
problem?
I mentioned in the webinar, this whole IT about data security, intelligence, intellectual properties, all this type of thing has really moved up the curve. It was below 10 years ago. In the last couple of years, most supply chain people are saying it's in the top third, think it's the most important, and 71% in the top two-thirds. So this has really moved up. It's in the top 10. Just think of cybersecurity or ransom programs that put your computer at ransom. This thing has really moved up. And one of the issues, as many people know on the webinar, is that just because of the complexity of IT systems and the way it kind of grew over the years, people typically have one source. They have either one mainframe, or they might have one large ERP system such as SAP or Oracle. And so it's absolutely correct that you have a single source. Now the question is, it's certainly dependence, but what do you do about it? One other thing I should mention before I mentioned that many times it's all in one data center, right? So you have the physical data center, then you have the mainframe as the single source, and you have many of these large ERP type systems. So what do you do? So one thing you can do, you can partner with, let's just take an example like IBM. IBM might give you the hardware. They can provide backup if necessary at an alternate site. And so if anything happens, they have complete backup, and they can have a plan in place that if for some reason your site goes down for any reason, whether the whole site goes down or the computer goes down or there's cyberware type problems or ransomware problems, they can then have a backup that's clean that they can quickly load and get your business up and running. I know that's not easy, but I think it's not going to get to the point where people start running multiple IT systems in this particular area. And I think this is an area where particularly risk managers, it is changing every minute. I just read an article about this ransomware. It's hitting large companies where they're telling these companies, if you don't fix this in 7 days, we're gonna shut your whole computer down. So it's really something that is changing. So I think many of the people on the webinar that are involved in this really need to get on top of this and engage your IT people, just like you engaged your procurement people early on years ago. You need to get them in the room and have them talk about what their backup contingency plans are.
We have a question from someone who works for a transnational nonprofit organization that depends on contractive services. And they want to know how to apply these principles to the building of capacity and services.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it's the same. I know that's hard for people sometimes to realize, but they have many of the same type of, these principles will work both in profit and nonprofit. And let me just give a hypothetical example that I know a little bit about, but not to say this is totally real, but I think it probably would hit home. So let's take the American Red Cross, for example, right? So the American Red Cross has some sort of, hurricane comes through, hits Haiti, all feet on the ground. They got to get down there quickly, and they have many, many suppliers that help give both people and goods and services into Haiti. Those services are very important in order for them to work. So they have a couple problems. Number one, they have to act quickly. So they need very quick, high capacity particular planes and people to be able to get them down to the site. It's no different than many times the raw material. If there's a problem with the raw material, you got to be able to act quickly. You got to have backup plans, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really not all that much difference, and services would be the same in a manufacturing environment. You need some sort of backup plan. And I would argue that American Red Cross is just as an example, I happen to know this because I saw a presentation, is that they make most of their donations during these times. Now, many times they're specific to the Haiti or whatever crisis they're handling. But so this is very important to a nonprofit, much like a brand might be to a company. So you have like I talked earlier, a very important brand that's a high margin that affects your P&L, both revenue and profits. This is the same thing. If they goof this up and don't get to Haiti for whatever reason, or they get there and there's a problem and many people are on the 24/7 news complaining about it, they will get less donation. That affects their revenue stream. So I guess I would argue that there really isn't a lot of differences, and I think these principles apply either for profit or nonprofit.
Very good. Our last question today is basically UK specific, but anywhere where there's a migrant crisis, we have some potential disruption. And government strategies tend towards protection, guards, gates, badges, and guns, and it tends to push the problem into different venues. But supply chains still get disrupted. How do companies prepare, whether in the UK or the United States or anywhere, how do companies prepare for such disruptions as the migrant crisis that we see? How do we deal with that?
Well, I'm not overly familiar with the incident because I've read in the paper and seen some videos on it, so I'm a little bit familiar with it. So I don't want to act as an expert in this particular area, but let me make a couple of comments to think about. I mean, obviously, the problem they're worried about is making sure they can get their goods through trucking through Calais or wherever it's going through into the UK. And I think the problem that they're worried about is that those particular problems could either stop the trucking because there's problems with the migrants, so they can't get through, therefore it can't get to the destination. Or worse than that, something happens on a site, such as some sort of a protest, or worse than that, I won't have to mention what it might be, and it might stop it completely. So one thing to think about, at least on the trucker side, is that one might think that you'd want to make sure that whatever you're shipping in, that there are no migrants in your particular truck. Many times they sneak on the trucks. One of the problems in Europe and the UK, they use soft side trailers, which is a problem, but you could easily put it in a container type of thing and put a lock on the door, and then have it maybe certified by yourself or somebody else that there's nothing else in the container. And at least that way you wouldn't bring people in that would stop your particular truck. I don't think that's the bigger issue. I think the bigger issue might be some sort of a disruption due to the government or the migrants causing some sort of disruption. And I think it reminds me, at least, of what happened in the United States and the West Coast strategies, where there were strikes or potential strikes out of the LA area. And what people did was, from a contingency plan, was that they said, look, this is unpredictable. We don't know week to week what's going to happen. So they did what most good supply chain people do. They rerouted the shipments to Vancouver, Canada, and it cost them some money to do it. I know one particular outfit I was talking to. They said, "Well, this is very difficult because it increased my cost." Well, it also increased your cost when the thing doesn't get unloaded for 10 days, right? So my view is the first thing I would do is there other places you can ship through that you don't have this particular problem? That would be particularly one strategy. And then in addition to that, I know that people don't think about it. You ought to think about, do you have a backup plan like air freight? So you may have some very critical components that get stuck at this particular port, and you got to have it. Well, do you have inventory in your supplier that you then can put on an airplane and fly it over? Again, very, very, very expensive, but it certainly beats shutting your plant down for 10 days. So I just think sometimes we need to think a little deeper. I certainly can't address the overall migrant problem. It's a very difficult problem, but certainly maybe some proactive stuff up front where you're clean. Maybe you can work with the government to put some sort of a pre-checking thing in, such that once you get through that, you can get into the country with no hassles. And then more importantly, I do think you need to think about rerouting and maybe potentially using air freight as a backup.
Thanks again, Don. You've made a wonderful presentation today. A recording of this and all our other webinars is posted on my DRI. I'm Russell Wooldridge, and this webinar has been a production of DRI International 2017, all rights reserved. Thank you for your attention.